続きまして、ジョン・メトローさんによる OpenWFEru RubyWorkflow エンジンです。それではジョンさんお願いいたします。
こんにちは。私はメトロです。新横浜に住んでいます。でも私の日本語ちょっと小さいです。だから、I will switch to English. Sorry. ごめんなさい。So I'm here to speak about an open source Ruby workflow engine. It's the enterprise track. So I'm developing this open source project to use business processes on top of Ruby. So what is that? What is workflow? What is BPM? And what is this OpenWFEru thing that is hard to pronounce? So it's an application written in Ruby. So, well, that's a RubyKaigi, of course. And before it was written in Java. I started this project in 2001, and it was a Java workflow engine. And then I fell in love with Ruby, like most of you here, I think. And I started writing it in Ruby since last year. So if it's an application, it's a tool, it must be a solution to some kind of problem. But what kind of problem? So, as said, this is the enterprise track. So it features mainly applications for enterprises, organizations, companies. And let's take a look at what is an organization. I'm going to show you some dots, but those dots don't belong to one company or one physical geographical locations. So an organization is a set of people usually. And those people are grouped in divisions, like for instance here the human resources division and the accounting division. And maybe those people are attributed roles, and there are not only people in an organization, there are also resources, and why not, let's call them services. So I call them participants because they participate into business processes, into workflows. So there are many business processes within a company. Most of them are just phone conversations, emails, post-its that you put on a board for the whole team to see, and things like that. And they connect the dots that the participants are in the company. Business processes, they are at the heart of your activity. You're meant to produce value for your customers, not your shareholders, and thus all those interactions are business processes. But somehow people do go and others do arrive, and processes have to adapt. And also there is the quest for rentability, and you try to have the smallest possible business processes. Lots of changes. And those changes are usually triggered by changes within the organization, changing within the environment that surrounds the organization. And there is always this quest, as I've said, for optimization, rentability. Some may call it business process reengineering. You've got to produce value for your customer at the least cost possible. So that's the quest. You have to have really tight business processes, and you have to adapt, you have to be agile to survive in the enterprise world, the company's fight. One thing that I've noticed is that processes do change more often than participants do. I come from Switzerland. The next big country to the west is France, where it's a bit harder to fire someone than in the US. So it's usually difficult to change people, to find the right skills and stuff like that. So usually business processes do change more often than participants in your organization do. So you end up with one organizational model, one organigram, and a set of business processes. So it's easier to change something that is immediately available, like a record in a database. But in our case, we need something that is first-class citizen, and we need that for participants and processes. We could say that participants are services. The person just before me used the term SOA, so it's not that far. It's a current buzzword. We've got a service-oriented architecture. We've got companies that are aware of that, this style. So those services, they are participants into business processes, two business processes. And of course, currently, the business processes as we find them in applications are usually embedded, and it's hard to change. So where processes are first-class citizens, I mean processes in a large sense. Well, in an operating system, where you can fork them, you can send signal to them, you can exit, you can do lots of things with them. They are first-class citizens in operating system, processes, but I use the term in a wider sense. So, and in an operating system, you've got lots of processes running. So, well, maybe that's not a good image, but you could think of participants and files and devices. So, for your operating system processes, you have files and devices. They are the participants to the processes. So we might think that a company is an operating system for business processes. I'm thinking about all the business processes, the one that you do with phone calls, with emails, with mailing lists, with wikis, and everything. All of these business processes, your company, your organization is an operating system for that. And some business processes are interesting to digitize. So why not let's use an open source workflow engine to do that, to run those business processes. Where there are two first-class citizens, again, participants and processes. And so we are closer to where things change. We change the processes, we change the participants. We try not to change the screens, we try not to change the controllers or things like that. We try to change what really changed in the organization. So a workflow engine takes as input an organizational model, an organigram, some process definitions, and outputs. The output is the running, executing the processes. Let's take a look at some code. Here I start an engine in memory, very simple, no persistence at all. I register some participants. The simplest participants in Ruby are those block participants. I use the person's name, but here it's rather automatic. Just receive some piece of work, change the value in that, the payload of that piece of work, and then it will go back to the engine and the flow will resume. That's just a simple block participant. And then let's connect the dots and send the work from Alice to Bob. That's a simple process definition in XML. Very, very small process. But you can launch lots of them with a launch item, not a lunch item, not a bento, just a launch item. You set an initial value and you launch the process. You can launch many processes, have many participants. That's basically what you do with the workflow engine. And so let's have a small look at those process definitions. So I'm using XML here. You've got a sequence. XML has a tree structure, so it's quite easy to use it. I'm just routing the work from participant Alice to participant Bob. But you can do smarter things. The workflow engine does the heavy lifting for you. You've got a concurrence here. You don't have to think about threads and things like that and blocking, waiting. You just say a concurrence. You divide the work between Alice and Bob so that the business process is a bit more efficient because you know that Bob will not slack while waiting for Alice working. But since I moved to Ruby, there was some guy saying, hey, John, you should use YAML to define process. And I was like, wow, why not? But since we're in Ruby, sorry. No, this amounts, I'll speak about this YAML idea a bit later. This amounts, this process that you see here with this concurrence amounts to that in UML. There are other process definition language in other workflow engines, not in Ruby, using some kind of graphical representation. But that amounts to that in the end on the disk. So it's not as, it's quite equivalent to the sum of information that you have, the programming you have here, but well, that's a lot. So I prefer my small XML notation because it's easier to diff simply. When you want to, hey, that process changed, I want to put it in Subversion and track the changes in my business processes. Because it features high-level concepts and not joins and things like that. And, well, it's concise. So that's the same argument. So back to those XML process definition. So somebody asked for YAML process definition, but wow, YAML seemed very difficult to write from scratch. I'd prefer generating YAML. But as I was considering the idea, I came up with, well, sorry. Well. So let's use Ruby to do that. Sequence, concurrence, participant, and it's quite easy to do that with Ruby. And what big advantage that you can see here is that the process definition becomes a Ruby class. And that fits the mindset of the developers. A process definition is just a class. And when you launch it, you get a process instance. And, well, it remains the same. You feed the process definition into the initial data set and you launch the process definition. So you can do better things with Ruby now into the process definition game. Here, just before launching, you simply take a list of participants to add to your concurrence. So Ruby can be used as a macro language for business process definition. That's quite handy. And you can note here that the concurrence is waiting for 2 answers. So if Doug is slacking, the engine will just go on with the work produced by Alice and Bob. That's all. So just a smaller note. So now the Ruby version of my workflow engine consumes XML and Ruby process definitions. And once he has one, he can generate the other and back and forth. And it's quite cool to be able to use Ruby as a macro language for business process definition. Some of the expressions in the process definition language, I list them: participant, process definition, concurrence, sequence, timeout, sleep, wait, redo, undo, cancel. It's much demanded. Lesson is like in concurrent programming language where you say, I want to listen to that channel and then trigger some code. But here the channels are participants, so you can do things like that. But the workflow engine does all the heavy work for you. And it looks like a bit like Lisp. And you can cancel process, of course. But these are expressions. Now about participants. I've shown you before this very simple, very Ruby-ish block participant. But there are more participants that come with OpenWFE when you download it. Male participants, thanks Alain. You can put the work into Amazon Simple Queue service. You could store the work into YAML files and set up work lists and things like that and share it with other applications, or just whatever, active whatever thing. Just use Ruby. A small slide about the work items, what they are. They are simply a payload, a hash, with an identifier. Where am I in the process definition, and to which process instance do I belong? And just a participant's name when the work goes out of the engine to a participant. It's quite flexible, neutral. I'm Swiss, so it's neutral, so here it is. Now we've got those definitions, those participants, the engine, but those processes usually, they run longer than the engine. A business process may take like a few seconds, or it may run for months and months. So persistence is required, of course, but you got to be able to stop and restart those business processes, because somehow you might want to migrate them. Perhaps you want to have an engine per division in your organization, and you might want to move those business processes from that main engine to the engine of the divisions. And of course there are fixes to do, because things break and you've got to be able to fix and then restart the business processes. For that, I'm going to show some code. Here you've got a cached file persisted engine. File persisted uses YAML files to store the state of the business processes, and cached because we need some kind of performance. You can add services to the engine, and here, for instance, I add a history just to know what happened, and a journaling service, so that we can do things like replay the journals of a business process, replay a business process on a new engine, or simply fix. Here, a participant was missing, we add it, and then we replay the process instance at the last error. So all is done, the heavy lifting is done for you, it's all in Ruby. Some kind of a slide about the architecture. Usually you might want to put a Rails application in front of that to have beautiful forms and things, and because Rails is very flexible, change once again, the changes in the business processes are very minimalistic to do on both sides, on the engine, business process engine side, and on the presentation engine that Rails is. And you can take advantage of all the Ruby ecosystem, all the nice things like camping, reports, AP4R, DRB, and JRuby and the whole Java circus. Thanks, guys. And REST. When I started in 2001, in 2003 I implemented a REST interface for my workflow engine, and I've ported it this year to the Ruby workflow engine. So you can use the workflow engine from various platforms. From Peanuts, I think it's a Japanese scripting language. It works quite well. So we've got here now, right now, we've got this workflow engine. It's at version 0.9.11. It uses currently a YAML and file system persistence, but maybe some of you might come with better persistence means. There is this old REST interface. I don't think I will implement a new one, because with Rails you can get quite easily a nice REST interface for not much work. It has this journaling feature, which is very important, and lots of more things. About the usage of it, I've got my friend Pat, who is using it for composing data coming from satellite sensors into nicer looking reports. I've seen job offers stating we want OpenWFE skills. So that was quite cool to read. And I've got friends using it, and I'm using it myself. So for the future, I want it to run on JRuby so that I can use it in the things I do for my day job, because this workflow engine is just my hobby, let's say. But I use it at work, but I need to put it into an application, a Java application, so I need it to run on JRuby. But there are issues with the safe levels, but sandboxing maybe later might solve all of this. A web process definition designer, I really need that. I've been in contact with a team who would like to start that, maybe with Rails and Flex, and that would be really cool to design processes graphically. Well, Ruby is here. I prefer to hack the processes, the business processes definition in Ruby, but some people want it graphically, so they want to start a project about that. I will implement monitoring tools and simulation tools as well. For the moment, the simulation tools are quite restricted to test cases. That covers a lot, but I need more. And I want to be able to support other process definition language, but that's a really second priority. I want it more distributed. I'd like engines to speak a bit more. They can currently send work items to each other, send work and start processes among each of them, but I'd like more distribution. I'd also like to start a small project about ad hoc processes. Instead of defining the processes and dealing Taylor style, just enforcing the process, why not listen to the business processes in the company and then have the tool tell you, okay, we used that and we did that, so we could automate it. Like, for instance, when you take a look at your bash history and you decide to, okay, I could really put that into a script. But the same thing for business processes. And more documentation. So I'd like to say thanks to my friend Sakaguchi Masa, who just translated the website to Japanese. So the whole website for OpenWFEru is available in Japanese. Thanks to Sakaguchi Masa. And there are many things. So please contact me if you are interested in participating and bringing great stuff to this workflow engine, or integrating it into other great stuff. So that's it for me. Arigatou gozaimashita.
ありがとうございました。それでは質疑応答に移りたいと思います。質問は日本語でも英語でもどちらでも良いので、それでは質問がある方は挙手をお願いいたします。どなたか質問ある方はいらっしゃいますか？それではそちらの方。
吉田と言います。日本語ですみません。ビジネスプロセスの定義の部分は XML でも Ruby のクラスで書いた場合も同等ですか？どちらかに制限があるとかいうことはないですか
？So about XML and Ruby definitions, I think there are no restrictions. With XML comes lots of tools available to use them to write XML. And with Ruby, there are more and more tools. I think that Ruby process definitions are easier to read, and you can do those macro with them. So it's quite powerful, but you can use both.
ありがとうございます。私も XML 嫌いなんで素晴らしいと思います。
どういたしまして。
他に質問ある方いらっしゃいますか？ではそちらの真ん中ら辺の方。
根本と申します。BPEL との違いは、どういう視点があるでしょうか。
OpenWFE, the process definition language, is a bit easier than BPL, but very close. You've got two families of process definition languages, graphical oriented and process calculus oriented. I've got to say that my process definition language is a bit like BPL. I think, honestly, that in 2 weeks I could implement the BPL expressions on top of OpenWFEru quite easily. It's not that hard. They are very close.
ありがとうございます。
どういたしまして。
他に質問ございますでしょうか。よろしいですか。それではこれで終わりにいたします。ジョンさん、ありがとうございました。